Today's story, my business partner of 12 years stole everything from me, so I spent 18 months taking it all back with interest. Let me tell you something about rock bottom. People describe it like it's a single moment, a dramatic crash, a thunderclap, a before and after photo. What nobody tells you is that sometimes rock bottom is a Tuesday. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, bad coffee in hand, when you sit down at your desk and realize the man you trusted most in the world has been systematically dismantling your life for 3 years. My name is James. I'm 44 now, which means I was 42 when my world fell apart, and 40 when Rick apparently decided that 12 years of friendship and partnership wasn't worth as much as his own ambition. I'm telling this story because someone out there needs to hear that the slow, patient, calculated approach is almost always better than the dramatic one. I could have blown everything up on day one. I'm very glad I didn't. Let me back up. Rick and I met at 28, both of us junior consultants at the same management firm, both of us chronically underpaid and absolutely convinced we were the smartest people in every room we walked into. The kind of arrogance only your late 20s can fully sustain. We used to eat terrible sandwiches at our desks and talk about how we'd do everything better if we ran our own shop. In our early 30s, we stopped talking about it and actually did it. We founded Meridian Consulting, business strategy and operational restructuring for mid-sized companies. We scraped together our savings, maxed out credit cards, worked out of Rick's spare bedroom for the first 8 months, and somehow through a combination of skill, stubbornness, and genuinely excellent timing, it worked. By year 5, we had 12 employees and our first $1 million client. By year 10, we had 43 staff, offices in 2 cities, and a reputation that meant clients came to us. By year 12, Meridian was worth somewhere between $8 and $10 million depending on who was doing the valuing and what mood they were in. I was proud of that company the way some men are proud of their children. Every late night, every missed anniversary dinner, every weekend I spent on a client call instead of doing literally anything else, it all lived in Meridian's walls. My wife Claire had been patient and supportive for years, though by year 11, patient and supportive had quietly become distant and resigned. That's a different story and one I take partial responsibility for, but it's relevant context. Now Rick. Rick was charming, extroverted, a brilliant salesman who could make any client feel like they were his oldest friend. I was the operational brain, the one who actually built the systems, managed delivery, and made sure we didn't promise things we couldn't execute. We complemented each other perfectly, which is exactly why I trusted him so completely. Trusting someone completely is, as it turns out, an excellent way to miss what they're doing. The first sign was small enough that I almost didn't register it. In January of my 41st year, I noticed that the Hargrove account, one of our largest, had renewed their contract, but the revenue numbers in our system looked slightly lower than what I remembered quoting. I mentioned it to Rick, who said the CFO had negotiated a small discount during renewal and he'd approved it to keep the relationship. Reasonable. I moved on. The second sign came 3 months later. A client I hadn't spoken to in a year, Gerald Patterson of Patterson Manufacturing, called my cell directly. He was confused about some invoices. When I dug into it, it appeared Patterson had been quietly transferred to a consulting firm called Apex Strategy Partners, a firm I'd never heard of. Rick said Patterson had outgrown our scope and he'd referred them to Apex as a favor. Didn't I mention that? I thought I mentioned that. He had not mentioned that. I filed that one away too, in a mental folder I hadn't consciously labeled yet. The third sign was the one that blew the folder wide open. In October, I was looking for a contract template on our shared server and stumbled across a folder I didn't recognize buried inside a billing subdirectory named with a string of numbers that looked like a date. Inside were documents. Client contracts. Not Meridian contracts, Apex Strategy Partners contracts. With our clients. Signed by Rick. Going back almost 3 years. I sat very still for a very long time. Then I did something that I genuinely believe was the smartest thing I've ever done in my life. I closed the folder, cleared my browser history, walked to the kitchen, made a fresh coffee, came back to my desk, and continued my day as though I'd found absolutely nothing. Because here's what I understood in that moment, with horrible clarity. Rick hadn't made a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a structure, sustained operation spanning 3 years. He had built a competing firm using our clients, our relationships, possibly our proprietary methodology, and probably our money. This wasn't a confrontation situation. This was a war, and I had just accidentally seen his battle plans. If I confronted him, he'd destroy evidence, move money, and lawyer up before I could blink. I'd get emotional, say things I couldn't unsay, and hand him every advantage. So instead, I smiled at him in the hallway that afternoon and asked if he wanted to grab lunch. He said sure. We had sandwiches. I made a joke about our early days eating terrible food at our desks. He laughed. I laughed. It was a lovely lunch. I went home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes, staring at the garage door. Then I went inside and told Claire I needed to talk to her. Not about us, about Rick. She listened to everything, and when I finished, she didn't say I told you so, even though she absolutely could have. She said, "What do you need?" That was the moment I remembered why I'd married her. What I needed, it turned out, was a forensic accountant, a technology specialist who could legally recover and document digital evidence, and a very specific type of attorney. Not a regular business litigation lawyer specialist in partnership disputes and commercial fraud. Someone who'd seen this before and knew exactly which moves to make and in what order. Finding them took 2 weeks. Vetting them took another week. I paid for the initial consultations personally, in cash, and I met every single one of them somewhere other than my office. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor, and she was extraordinary. In our first meeting, after I laid out everything I knew, she looked at me and said, "The instinct to wait was exactly right. Now here's how we do this properly." Sandra explained that what Rick had done potentially constituted breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trade secrets, tortious interference with business relationships, and depending on what the forensic accountant found, outright fraud and embezzlement. Any one of those was a serious lawsuit. All of them together was a category of legal catastrophe that tends to end careers permanently. But she was clear we needed evidence that was gathered correctly, documented meticulously, and completely airtight before we made a single move. Because the moment Rick knew what was coming, he'd try to countersue, claim the Apex work was done on his own time, argue grey areas in our partnership agreement, and generally make everything as expensive and painful as possible. Let him keep thinking he's safe, Sandra said. Comfortable people get sloppy. The next 14 months were the longest of my life. On the surface, I was a normal business partner. I attended our weekly leadership meetings. I had lunch with Rick regularly. I reviewed proposals, managed clients, gave feedback on pitches. I was, by every external measure, completely fine. Internally, I had become a documentary filmmaker of my own professional betrayal. The forensic accountant, a precise and deeply unsentimental man named David, found things that even I hadn't suspected. Over 3 years, Rick had funneled approximately $340,000 in consulting fees through Apex, money that should have come to Meridian. He'd also expensed personal travel, client entertainment for Apex clients, and equipment purchases through our company accounts. The total, with interest and accounting for diverted contracts, was closer to $800,000 once you factored in what Meridian should have earned. The technology specialist recovered deleted communications from our shared server, including emails between Rick and a lawyer helping him structure Apex specifically to avoid triggering non-compete clauses. He had been meticulous. Unfortunately for him, meticulous people leave meticulous records. By month 8, I had enough to end in 3 times over. Sandra told me to wait. By month 12, we had everything. Every diverted client, every forged expense, every deleted email. Sandra had assembled it into a legal case that she described with considerable professional satisfaction as a brick wall. Then came phase 2, which I think of fondly as the architecture of his downfall. Rick, feeling secure and apparently getting greedy, had started aggressively pursuing 2 of Meridian's largest remaining accounts for Apex. He was doing it carefully, not directly, but through referrals and soft introductions. Sandra and I decided it was time to move before he succeeded in taking anything else. We filed suit on a Thursday morning. Rick was served at his home at 7 a.m. Sandra had simultaneously filed for an emergency injunction freezing Apex's assets and preventing Rick from contacting any Meridian clients. I was in the office when Rick called me 40 minutes later. His voice had a quality I'd never heard from him before, a kind of brittle, cracking quality, like ice on a warm day. James, what is this? Which part are you unclear on? I said. Sandra can walk you through the specifics. You're serious. You actually... Rick. I kept my voice completely even. You built a competing company using our clients, our money, and our intellectual property. You did it for 3 years. I've known about it for 14 months. The only thing I'm surprised about is that you're surprised. Silence. A long, heavy silence. 14 months, he finally said. 14 months. I made very good use of the time. He tried anger. He tried negotiation. He even tried, briefly and unconvincingly, to suggest that Apex had been a mutually beneficial project that I'd somehow misunderstood. It was impressive in its desperation. I told him his lawyer would be in touch with Sandra and hung up. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate. Rick's personal attorney was good, but Sandra was better, and our evidence left very little room for a creative interpretation. In the end, Rick transferred his full ownership stake in Meridian to me for a fraction of its value, effectively buying himself out of a criminal fraud referral to the DA's office. He also signed the comprehensive settlement agreement, including a genuine non-compete, repayment of diverted funds on a structured schedule, and a confidentiality clause that I insisted be written in his favor as well as mine, because I didn't need the world knowing all the details, I just needed the outcome. Apex Strategy Partners dissolved within 60 days. 3 of the clients Rick had taken came back to Meridian, now solely mine. I want to be honest with you about what the victory felt like, because it wasn't the explosion of triumph I'd imagined. It was quieter. It felt more like setting down something very heavy that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. I sat in my office the evening the settlement was signed and ate a very expensive sandwich of the good kind this time, and allowed myself exactly 1 hour of satisfaction before starting to think about what came next. What came next was, frankly, better than anything that came before. I rebuilt Meridian over the following year, but differently. Smaller, leaner, with a leadership team I handpicked and a company structure that meant I was never again one relationship away from catastrophe. I also started a separate investment fund with a portion of the settlement recovery, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for while managing Rick and everything else. That fund has done quietly, stubbornly well. Claire and I, freed from the slow suffocation of my previous 80-hour weeks and the weight of a secret I'd been carrying alone, actually talked to each other properly for the first time in years. We went to counselling, which I had previously considered with the same enthusiasm I'd apply to a root canal. It turns out that talking to someone who's professionally obligated to help you communicate is extremely effective. We travelled. I took actual weekends. I learned, at the age of 43, that I genuinely enjoyed sailing, which surprised everyone including me. The lifestyle upgrade wasn't just financial, though that part was satisfying too. It was the upgrade of a man who stopped outsourcing his life to his ambition and started actually living it. New friends, real ones, not networking contacts. A marriage that felt like a partnership again. A company I was genuinely proud of, for reasons that had nothing to do with the revenue line. As for Rick, I heard through the industry grapevine that he landed at a small firm in another city. Significantly smaller. Significantly less senior. He's not my concern anymore, which is itself a kind of freedom I hadn't anticipated. The last thing I'll say is this. When I made that cup of coffee on the Tuesday, I found everything, and walked calmly back to my desk. I wasn't being brave. I was terrified. I was furious. I was grieving, in the particular way you grieve when you lose a person who isn't dead you just revealed. But somewhere in that walk between the kitchen and my desk, some part of my brain that had apparently been paying closer attention than the rest of me said, "Slow down, think clearly, and do this right." Best advice I ever gave myself. The chess analogy is obvious, and I'm going to use it anyway. Rick played checkers. He made bold moves, grabbed pieces quickly, and assumed the game would be over before anyone noticed. I played chess. I took my time. I thought 12 moves ahead. And when the game ended, I was the only piece still standing. To anyone out there who's just had their Tuesday moment that morning when the comfortable story you've been telling yourself cracks and the truth comes through, don't react. Not yet. Make a coffee. Take a breath. And start planning. Because the most satisfying revenge isn't the loud kind. It's the kind you've engineered so thoroughly that by the time the other person realizes what happened, it's already over. Update, posted 6 months later. A few people asked what happened with the client's record taken to Apex. 3 returned to Meridian within the first year. 1 stayed elsewhere, which I respect. The business relationships are their own thing. The 5th client, Patterson Manufacturing, Gerald Patterson himself, called me after the settlement became loosely known in the industry. We had coffee. He brought his business back and referred to additional companies. Gerald is now something of a mentor figure, which I did not expect and am genuinely grateful for. Rick reached out once, about 8 months after the settlement. A short email. He said he was sorry, that he'd convinced himself it was justified because he felt undervalued, that he knew that wasn't an excuse. I read it twice. I thought about it for a day. Then I replied with 2 words I know. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Just acknowledgement that I understood what he was saying and that I'd moved far enough past it that a longer response felt unnecessary. Claire read the exchange over my shoulder and said that was very mature. I told her I'd been practicing. She laughed. I made dinner. We opened a good bottle of wine. Life, it turns out, is considerably more enjoyable when you're not carrying someone else's betrayal on your back. Who knew?